Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this program, Botany Meets Biology, the Plight of the Sage-grouse. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the Community Relations team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme in our programming, and this month's theme is place. Our presenter is Dr. Stu Garrett. He is the Sage-grouse coordinator for the local East Cascades Audubon Society, where he has worked with local, state, and federal land management agencies. He co-founded the local chapter of the Native Plant Society of Oregon, and he has served on the state boards of the Nature Conservancy, the Oregon Environmental Council, the University of Oregon Museum of Natural and Cultural History, and the Native Plant Society of Oregon. He also practiced family medicine in Bend from 1978 to 2012. Thank you so much, Stu, for sharing about this local species and their unique adaptations to our ecology.
Well, thank you, Laurel, for a good introduction. And I appreciate the library's interest in sage-grouse. And so if we're all set, I'll go ahead and start. Well, this is the first image that I know of a sage-grouse. And it was drawn by William Clark on the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1805, 1806. Nobody will ever accuse him of being a fabulous artist, but he did his best and under trying circumstances. I'm amused by the flesh is only tolerable. They had been eating a lot of deer and elk and buffalo, and apparently the sage-grouse didn't just measure up. This is probably the next attempt to depict a sage-grouse. This is by John James Audubon, about 1835, and he did a good job, much more artistic. Audubon probably never saw a live sage-grouse. He used skins that he had gotten from Nuttall and Townsend, and so did a pretty nice job for drawing from painting from a skin. He didn't include any sagebrush, unfortunately. This is before they really understood how dependent the sage-grouse was on sagebrush. And over the eye is not red, it's actually yellow, but we'll cut some slack for John James Audubon. I'm not one that likes to read the slides to people, so I'm going to let you guys go ahead and read what I've printed there. And the point being is that there were a lot of sage-grouse around early on, and all the early explorers commented on it. George Grinnell was an early biologist who traveled through the West. He was an early conservationist. It makes me a little nervous when he talks about passenger pigeons, because at one time we had probably up to 2 billion, B with a billion, passenger pigeons, and now we have none. So as the sage-grouse becomes less and less numerous, it makes me nervous. The height of the sage-grouse population is estimated about 14 million birds. That varies. Some people say under 10, some people say over 20, but 14 million is used pretty frequently, so I'll go with that. Currently, range-wide in the 11 western states, we have 400,000. It's about a 97% decrease from the 14 million number. Here in Oregon, we still have a little over 14,000 birds left. This is the range of the sage-grouse. The green is prior range. The blue is the current range. The grouse have been extirpated from Canada now. They're close to being gone in North and South Dakota. They're no longer in Arizona, New Mexico. So their range is decreasing. This is a population graph of the grouse. It starts here in about 1980. These graphs are based on spring counts at the leks, and we'll talk about leks in a minute. But as you can see, the trend is not good. It's definitely going down. We had a maximum of about 45,000 early 90s. We're now down about, as I said before, about 14,000 birds. And there's no doubt that the sage-grouse is exquisitely adapted to the sage steppe system. And the sage steppe system provides everything that it needs. And You might be interested to know in this photo, there's actually a sage-grouse there right in the middle. And this will be a recurrent theme, is how well adapted the sage-grouse is to our sagebrush. In 2010, when people were trying to get the sage-grouse listed under the Endangered Species Act, all the states got interested in trying to forestall that and try and help the bird. And in the state of Oregon, we put together a plan, and it was based on 20 PACs, priority areas for conservation. And here's our PAC right here, called the Brothers PAC. But there's 20 other of these scattered throughout the state. And those PACs have about 90% of the birds in them that occur in the state of Oregon now. We had some other areas called sagebrush focal areas in the southern part of the state down here, which were put together because they're good habitat and have a lot of sagebrush. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a few minutes. So this is a diagram, a map of our PAC. Here's the Brothers PAC. Here's Highway 20. Bend is way off to the left. Here's Milliken. Here's Brothers. South of Highway 20, most of the land is BLM, and it's public ownership. North of Highway 20, a lot of the land, it's in white, is privately owned, and there's a lot of private ownership there. I should say all these PACs are kind of the same and kind of different. They all have sage-grouse, they all have sagebrush, but there are different conditions in each one, and you can't assume that what happens in one PAC is also going to happen in another. This is looking from Pine Ridge south over our Brothers PAC. You can see this beautiful sagebrush country here all the way south towards the Buttes down near Lakeview. This light area is where we've had a fire. There's not been much fire in our area in sage-grouse habitat, and that so far has been a good thing. And we'll talk about fire in a little while. About 6 years ago, the East Cascades Audubon Society came to me and said, we need to get more involved with the sage-grouse issue. Would you be willing to do that? And I said, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And we ended up setting up a ECAS, East Cascades Audubon Society science team consisting of folks with a lot of postgraduate work, PhDs and masters in various biological areas. And it's turned out to be a really good cooperative group. We've spent a lot of time in the field, done a lot of research, and I think we have some good ideas that we'll talk about tonight. I just happen to be the one talking tonight. Well, I do want to emphasize that the grouse is a specialist in the sagebrush, and we'll talk about how that works. And that's versus a generalist like a robin or crow, house sparrows, who can kind of survive anywhere. But these birds need intact sagebrush steppe and a lot of it. I'm going to start off with a little bit of grouse biology. And that's a chicken, and so is this kind of a chicken, but they have pretty similar systems. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the grouse do not have gizzards. Gizzards are those really strong muscular features that can grind up seeds, and so in heavy cellulose. So the grouse don't eat seeds, they don't eat grass, they don't have a gizzard. The second thing that's important to point out is that they have what's called cecae. And the cecae are residual structures in us. Maybe the appendix might have been at one time a cecum. But the cecae in sage-grouse have the job of separating all the hydrocarbons, the terpenes and the coumarins that are found in sagebrush leaves and can actually be toxic. The cecae separate that out from the proteins, and then they actually expel them, and we'll see that in a minute. So this is very important. This is what allows the sagebrush during the winter to eat nothing but sagebrush leaves. And then in the grouse cloaca, it's basically a dehydrator. Anything that comes out of the grouse is practically water-free. particularly during the winter time. So this is how the grouse conserve water. Most well-respected grouse biologists do not feel that the grouse need to drink. They get metabolic water and water from what they eat. And this is what grouse poop looks like. These are the sort of pellets you see during the winter when it's eating primarily sagebrush leaves. And this is the so-called cecal tar that the cecum emits and gets rid of all the toxins. So sage grouse, they don't eat seeds or grass. They eat forbs and insects. And we're going to talk a lot about this. Forbs, the sagebrush leaves, and then the insects. Sagebrush is their food, and grass is pretty much hiding cover and not food. Now, I want to start out by going through the seasons of the sage grouse. We start in February and March when the grouse go to the leks. And leks it's a Swedish word that means dancing. And they do their mating dance there. If you want to Google, sagebrush mating, you'll get dozens of great videos where you hear this bizarre popping sound and can watch what's going on. But I didn't want to spend time on that today. You can easily see that. They breed right on the lek, and then the hens go away and they nest usually within 1 to 4 miles of where the lek is. And then as spring develops and the flowers and grasses start coming out, early brood rearing period. And then as things dry up in June, July, in the summer, late brood rearing. And then in winter, the grouse spend time in the sagebrush, and we'll talk about that. This is a pretty typical appearance of a lek. It usually doesn't have much in the way of sagebrush. It's pretty open. There's some risk there with predators, but the grouse have mating on mind, and so they don't pay a lot of attention to that sort of stuff. The females will be seen sometimes on the periphery, and they're the ones who kind of watch all the males and decide which male they want to mate with, and they are in charge. We have a lot of lek sites in southeastern Oregon. The yellow ones are the ones that are still active. The red, black, and blue areas are ones that, for whatever reason, are inactive. So you can see we've got a lot of grouse scattered over southeastern Oregon. They're very picky. When they go to nest, they want to choose a nest that's kind of umbrella-like, spreading out, which gives them a lot of protection. And this sort of sagebrush would not work for them. There's not enough cover there, and they would be open to predation. So they're picky about where they nest in sagebrush. This is a nest. Here's the hen sitting on the nest. A couple of the eggs have hatched. And so that's a pretty typical nest site. The hens lay several eggs, usually 6 to 8 eggs. And predation starts early. The ravens really like to get into a nest, and they'll follow the birds back to the nest, so they have to be very sneaky about that. Chick predation can happen too. The young chicks, they don't start flying until they're about 5 weeks old, so they're on the ground and fairly slow for a long time. There's a saying that no sage grouse dies of old age, and it's probably true. Coyotes would love to have a sage grouse for breakfast. So let's go to the early brood rearing period. And that happens out in the sagebrush. And I'm going to talk about overstory and understory. And when I say overstory, I mean the actual sagebrush plants themselves. They're higher, and they're the overstory. The understory are the forbs, the wildflowers, and the grasses that are underneath the sage. So what's a forb? Well, basically a forb is a wildflower, a broadleaf plant that's not a grass. It's actually a Greek word. I'm not sure why we use phorb rather than wildflower, but every discipline has its peculiarities. I'm glad we don't spell it with a PH. But these are good shots of forbs. And with forbs, the most preferred part are these anthers. These are little bombs with protein and fat and nutrients, and they're really important. The young grouse chicks can easily eat those and do eat those. They also eat the other flower parts of the forbs. These petals and sepals are made of hemicellulose. They're a lot easier to digest. So you'll see a lot of actual blossoms that are eaten by the chicks. And this is an example of how the sage-grouse like to eat them. They don't like the really heavy parts. They eat the softer, flimsier parts of the leaves. So late brood mirroring, later in the season when things start to dry up, they go out to these playas, which are the dry areas and moist for part of the year, out in east of here that you've probably seen before in your travels in Eastern Oregon. They also like to go to wet meadows as other areas start to dry up and where there's a lot of succulent forbs. And they go up to higher elevations. They sort of follow the green line up. So as spring goes up in elevation, so do the grouse. And then there's winter time. And actually, the grouse do really fine in winter. They have the lowest death rate in winter, which is different from a lot of other birds. They actually will eat 100% sage-grouse leaves, sagebrush leaves, and they'll gain weight. The sagebrush actually has really high protein, is very nutritious for them. There's less predation during the winter. They burrow in the snow, they eat snow. So they're just happy in the winter, and they come out of that in breeding season in good shape. Let's talk a little bit about the sage-grouse diet. This is a diagram of the diet of the adults. And for most of the year, they're eating, for about half the year, they're eating sagebrush leaves, basically. During the spring and summer, they add a lot of forbs and insects. Please note that grass is just a very small part of their diet, almost by accident. So this is the adult diet. Sagebrush in the winter and insects and forbs in the summer. And if you looked in the gut of a sage-grouse during the winter, this is what you'd see, just pretty much total sagebrush. Okay, the juvenile has a very different diet, though. Early on, the first 6 weeks or so, it eats a lot of insects and a lot of forbs. It can't really digest sage yet, so beyond about 6 weeks, they have to wait till they can do that. And then please note that just a very small amount is grass or seeds. There's hardly any of that the chicks are able to eat. So early in life, it's a lot of insects and forbs with sagebrush leaves coming in later on. And if you looked at the crop contents of a sagebrush during the summer, it might have a lot of these insects in it, which are mainly cicadas or grasshoppers. Well, why are forbs so important? Well, they're important because the chicks can't digest sage. They don't have the crop. They attract insects. So if you want insects, you're hanging out where there are wildflowers. They're nutritious. They taste good. And it turns out that it's very important for the pre-laying hens too. Hens have a much better nest success if they've been able to eat a lot of forbs. So in the end, during winter, it's sagebrush leaves. During the summer and spring, it's forbs and insects. And people wonder, well, how do we know that this is what has to happen? And so Johnson and Boyce in 1990 did a study where they went out and they collected over 200 eggs and they hatched those eggs into chicks. And then all the chicks, they gave different diets, or they divided into groups. And some had insects and forbs, some had only forbs and no insects, and some they gave more and more insects to. Well, they found out that if you were giving the right amount of insects and forbs, everybody lived. If you gave only forbs and no insect, all of those chicks died within 10 days. So insects are absolutely important early in the life cycle. And if you had more insects, you had a higher weight and better health. So insects were important. You may ask yourself, well, this is a bird. Why is it carnivorous? Why is it eating, insects and animals? Well, there's a reason for that. The sage-grouse is actually a descendant of the dinosaur. Dinosauria is in its evolution, and actually they are descended from dinosaurs of the theropod class, which were the carnivores. So when you see a bird out there, think dinosaur. And most of the birds do have high insect needs early on. When the chicks are young and can't get around very well, it's mainly ants and probably beetles crawling on the ground. A larva would be considered a special thing. And then later in the season, it's grasshoppers, etc. So we've seen recent declines in insect populations worldwide. A lot of other countries have done a better job of monitoring insects, and these are in protected areas. Germany, 80%, Puerto Rico, Austria, Britain, Netherlands. We've seen a 90% drop in monarchs. So insects are under stress in our current system, and it probably is having an effect on the sage-grouse. So there's several takeaways. It's important to remember the pre-laying hens need forbs for reproduction success. The chicks need large quantity insects or they die. And both chicks and hens need more forbs later on for good development. So is it possible that a diet that's deficient in forbs could be contributing to the demise of the sage-grouse? And, that's an important question. And it's one that I thought about, and I thought, well, what can we find out historically when we had more grouse around? What was going on then? Is there any way we can look at that? And so what I started to do is look at the period of settling in Oregon. And when the railroads came in, they really pushed a lot of people to move from the east and take homesteads or buy homesteads here in Central Oregon. And this is a 1919 map of Central Oregon. The PAC area is about right here. Bend is way up over here. Brothers is right about here. But all these little towns were there in the early 1900s. And there was a lot of people there. Most of these towns had a store and a bar and a saloon and a livery and, those kinds of things. Hardly any of them are left. Something a little bit left in Milliken and Brothers, but the rest of them are pretty much gone. So there's a lot of activity out there early on. And they brought their livestock with them. This is a photo of George Milliken's sheep herd in Milliken Valley. This is Pine Mountain up here, and this, of course, is Milliken Valley. A lot of these sheep herds were 2,000 to 3,000 sheep at a time. And here's another shot. This is Pine Mountain, and the sheep of Milliken out grazing. And I want to thank particularly the historical societies of the surrounding counties for these photos, and the Oregon Historical Society too, and USDA, U.S. Forest Service, and Denny Hansen sent me some pictures. Okay, if you haven't read Rube Long's Oregon Desert and you're interested in the Oregon Desert, it's really a good book, very entertaining, and gives you a lot of insight. But Rube made the point that there was a lot of competition there, and if sheep herder A didn't get all the forage, but sheep herder B certainly would. So nobody was grazing lightly back then. And when you have this many sheep going through an area, it can really hit it hard. This is down in Lake County somewhere. And this is a quote that tries to talk about the damage that huge sheep herds did. And again, more sheep, a few cattle up there too. And at one point, there was a lot of pressure on the desert and the sage steppe. And it was one of the heaviest stocked pieces in the whole country. So it was a real problem in Central Oregon. It wasn't just sheep. There were also horses at that time. And of course, cattle were here too. But the sheep were heavy early on. And things got bad enough and people complained enough that the U.S. Department of Agriculture sent one of their top botanists, Dr. Griffith, out to sort of look things over and decide what's going on. And so he did a report, and these are photos from that report. Here's near Steens Mountain, just basically some rocks and cow pies there and sheep pies and just no plants at all, hardly. Same sort of thing here. It's been eaten up. So it was enough of a problem that the cattlemen were upset with the sheepmen, and that led to the Sheep Shooters War of 1904. Actually went on for several years. Tens of thousands of sheep got killed. A couple people probably got killed. Created a big hullabaloo back east. So the Department of Agriculture and Interior sent people out to look around, find out what's going on. They decided, yeah, this is a problem. We need to protect some of these lands. And that's where we got the forerunners of our national parks and national forests. Well, is there other historical data we could look at to give us an idea of what's going on? And so I went to the General Land Office records. And these are online. You can visit this through the BLM website. And some of the surveyors made ecological comments. Like this one said, excellent bunch grass, some sage. Down here at this particular corner, it said, good bunch grass, some sage. So I went ahead and went through and read a bunch of those and marked them, and then got the old map and figured out where he was when he made those comments. And so then I took the old map and put it on a new map, and I went out and started doing some photos. And so when they said good bunch grasses, some sage, this is sort of what I imagined. Scattered sagebrush and good stands of native bunch grasses. So that's what I had in my mind's eye. When I went to the first spot to take a picture, this is pretty much what I saw. Just thick sagebrush with hardly any understory. I went to the next, and again, this is what we were looking for. We want bunch grasses and sage. The next site looked pretty similar to this, heavy sagebrush with hardly any understory. There are a few rabbit brushes blooming here. Again, another site with heavy sage and practically no understory. And again, more sage and a few scattered grass plants, but not much in the way of understory. And these were taken in June and July when there should have been forbs there if they are there. So basically we have a situation where over a period of time, for a number of reasons, the sagebrush has gradually increased and gotten thicker and denser and has suppressed the understory. The BLM in Utah has come to realize this. I haven't seen similar analysis from Oregon BLM yet. So let's talk a little bit about these sagebrush focal areas down in the southern and eastern part of the state, these green areas. This is in the Warner Mountains, this is in the Trout Creeks, and this is over in the Owyhee country. So when you visit the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Sage-grouse site, this is what they put up there, which I assume they think is pretty good habitat. This is down in California. This is Mono Lake. So this is a SFA, sagebrush focal area in southeastern Oregon in Malheur County. It's an area that's graze. It's about 6,000 feet, so a little higher than here, but good sagebrush, a lot of understory grasses, a lot of forbs there. This is great habitat for grouse. This is another one in Harney County. This is near McDermott, Again, in the spring, a lot of forbs that are blooming, attract the insects. The chicks can eat these blossoms and eat the insects. Good habitat. This is over in Beatys, Butte, which is Harney and Lake County. Again, good forbs and understory, good habitat. And this is at Hart Mountain National Antelope Refuge. And a lot of options here if you're a sage-grouse chick for something to eat. This is what it looks like east of Bend in the June, July. So a lot of sagebrush, but not much understory. And the question is, have we seen such depletion in our rangelands that we just have forgotten what normal is? And I think that's a possibility. Where you have a lot of sage, here's 25% sage cover. You don't see much underneath these sagebrushes. But here we've got 12% sage, where there's a lot of open areas. You see a lot of wildflowers, forbs, and grasses. So this 12% makes better breeding habitat. Now during the winter, the grouse may want to hang out in this 25% sage. Well, who eats forbs? Well, the answer is practically everybody. Sage-grouse, pronghorn, sheep, deer, cattle, rabbits, insects. And if you look at a grouse who weighs about 5 pounds and they're eating forage per pound basis, you've got a 250-pound sheep, that's the equivalent of 50 grouse. A cow and her calf could be the equivalent of 400 grouse. So there's a lot of competition for food. So a lot of us feel like we really need to restore the sage overstory, and we need to restore the forb and grass understory to help bring our grouse back. Well, how can this cycle of depletion be altered? Can disturbance reset the system for us? And we had an example of that recently. In 2016, there was a several hundred acre fire on Pine Mountain, and this is the burn right through here. That next year, we had a person who was a paraglider, and decided they were going to mow a landing spot on Deschutes National Forest property right here. And so we went out and looked at what was happening on this with the sage overstory being removed. How was the understory doing? And we looked particularly over here on the burn and over here on the mow. And this is what it looked like if you're down on the ground looking up towards Pine Mountain. Here's where the burn was. And the mowed area is this area right here where they actually took a mower and chopped up the sagebrush. In the mowed area before mowing, there was about 2% native forbs that were perennial. Within a couple of years after it, there was up to 8% perennial native forbs. That was a 400% increase. So yeah, we can grow forbs out there. In the burn area, where before it burned, it was about 2% understory. After the burn, we had 26% forb cover, 70% annual forb cover, for a total of 43% forb cover. Pretty dramatic change. It remained pretty good. This past year, they started grazing it after 3 years of rest, which was good. But they had a number of cows in there, and they left them in quite a while, and there's probably 90% utilization here. So we'll see if this wants to come back this spring. The Audubon Society decided we would try and see what we could do to maybe bring some forbs back. And so we've started putting out what we call Forb Islands. And this is where we're taking particularly Oregon sunshine, trying to seed it in there and see if it's going to take. We've put a small hardware cloth protection there to protect it from rodents and rabbits too. So we'll see how that goes. And this is the Oregon sunshine bloom this spring. This would be a magical place for a grouse hen. If she had a bunch of chicks, you take her in there and they're going to do very well. So I'd like to talk about the grouse as an umbrella species. And an umbrella species is one that if you do protection for that species, you're going to protect a lot of other species too. And in the Sagebrush Steppe, if we do a good job of taking care of the sage-grouse, we're going to help 300 animal and plant species that also live there. So the sage-grouse is an important bird, and if we can improve its habitat, we're going to help a lot of other important animals and plants. So there are other threats to the grouse. This is kind of the BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service approach to it. Drought clearly is a threat to these birds, and global warming is aggravating that. Fire is an issue. We'll talk about that. We've been talking about a little bit about invasive plants, but we'll see some more. The native understory we've discussed. Fences can be a risk in some areas. The Audubon Society spent a lot of time helping mark the fences so the birds won't fly into them. And then, of course, we discussed predators. One that hasn't been discussed is disease. And there's one disease out there that's been a problem, West Nile virus. And the West Nile virus was first described in Africa and Uganda in the 30s. It's an RNA virus similar to the COVID. It's related to dengue fever, St. Louis encephalitis, and others. Interesting story on West Nile is that we didn't have any West Nile virus in North America until 1999, and it arrived in New York City. In 2000, it spread to some surrounding states. 2001 continued to spread. 2002 headed west. 2003 was in Montana, Idaho. Didn't get to Oregon and Idaho until 2004. But when it came, it did some damage. And these are population graphs. Between 2004, 5, 6, that area, a lot of the populations were doing pretty well. Boom, they dropped down and haven't yet recovered. This is for the Oregon statewide. In the Lakeview BLM district, again, things were pretty good in the mid-2000s, but West Nile virus arrived, boom, dropped the population down. It has not recovered yet. Burns district, same thing, high population, early 2000s, the West Nile virus came and boom. So it's had an effect. And it's hard to treat that. It's mosquito borne, and it's been problematic. And we've done some mosquito trapping out in the east. We haven't uncovered it, but I am worried that this could be at low levels and intermittent and be impacting the grouse. There's a lot of human factors that are causing losses. Probably the most significant one is just 50% of the habitat is gone. Urbanization, agriculture, energy, roads, power, all that sort of stuff have taken its toll. The remaining habitat, probably up to 70% of that is degraded. It's not ideal. It's been depleted. And so we need to pay attention to that and try and do something about it. If you live in Wyoming and you're a grouse, you're in big trouble. The gas and oil energy industry there is really having impacts there, and I fear for the Wyoming grouse populations. Fire can be a good thing or a bad thing. Certainly it's going to see more of it with global warming. It's good in the sense that everything, all the plants out in Eastern Oregon are fire adapted. They're used to fire. But it's bad because after a fire, everything's pretty much gone. It takes a while to restore. And so you have to have some adjacent areas that those grouse can go to. Sometimes we have that, sometimes we don't. We've had some huge fires in southeastern Oregon, and these were hundreds of thousands of acres, up towards 500,000 acres. So we've done a pretty good job of fighting the fire. Most of the areas have rural fire protection equipment, and we're doing a lot better putting out fires early on. And in the good, bad side of the fire, this is the same fire, but this was a southern facing slope where it ended up mainly cheatgrass. This was a northern facing slope where it was mainly bunch grasses. And eventually sagebrush can come into this, In a lot of areas, they're actually going in and planting sagebrush because it takes longer. So one fire, two different results. And this is the result that's really scary. This is in Harney County where they had a big fire and it just came back total cheatgrass. This is very difficult to restore. In fact, I don't know of anybody who successfully restored this sort of land to true sage-grouse habitat. The rural fire protection districts are doing a good job of putting out the fires earlier. Juniper is another issue that we need to talk about. Juniper trees are native to Eastern Oregon. They're natural. They're good trees. There's a lot of animals, 80 species depend on them for their life cycle. But they're starting to increase in numbers. And with fire suppression, we've got a lot of juniper. And when they talk about juniper, they talk about phase one juniper, where the junipers are just early coming in. There's still a lot of sagebrush and understory. Phase two, where the junipers have started to exert their influence, but there still is some remnant sage and understory left. And then there's phase three, where the juniper controls everything. The sagebrush has dropped out. A lot of the forbs and the grasses are gone too. And so when we have more trees, which are these green dots, the higher density of trees, the lower density of the understory. So, and this is what some areas in Eastern Oregon are, what the agencies are doing. They're going in where there's scattered juniper, they're cutting them all and creating hopefully what could be instant habitat. I'm not sure it's working out the way they wanted it to, but that's what's happening now. This is a sage-grouse hen that had a GPS translocator on it. And so these are where the hen was going in her daily rounds of trying to find something to eat. You notice that she really doesn't like being in the forest. She'd rather be out in the open area. So, this goes along with trying to reduce juniper increase. And this is from the NRCS site. This is where they're the main agency that's cutting juniper. And this is where they're cutting juniper somewhere in Eastern Oregon. I sort of scratched my head at this because there is some sagebrush here, but the understory is gone. It looks like it's mainly cheatgrass. There's no forbs and not much native perennial bunch grasses. I would much rather see them going into a place like this where the junipers are just invading and where there's good sagebrush and there's good understory. And if they cut junipers there, this is where they have cut junipers several years ago. It gives open territory and good sage-grouse habitat. So I hope I've convinced you that the sage steppe is a fragile ecosystem. We need to be gentle and careful with it. Prevention is much easier and cheaper than restoration. And we need to be sure we have the right policies as far as management in the right places. Important takeaways, there's multiple threats to the grouse. It's just not one or two issues. The forb and grass understory is really important, as important as the sage overstory. The grouse have different ecological needs at different seasons. Half the year they eat forbs and insects, and the other half are pretty much sagebrush leaves. Improper grazing starting in 1870 had a long-term impact, and we're still suffering from that. And we need a lot of habitat restoration. So that's all I have to say. And if you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you, Stu. So we do have a couple questions here. Do the sage grouse eat snow as the equivalent of drinking water in the winter?
Yes, apparently they do.
Okay. And is the depletion of forbs due to human and livestock use? Is that the main idea now?
Well, there's several reasons why the forbs are depleted. One is thick sage overstory. So over years, for a variety of reasons, the sagebrush has gotten so thick that the forbs are depleted. Second one is lack of fire. If we had, and had all along fire, we'd probably have more forbs. And the third thing is the seed bank that's left. So those early impacts of grouse of grazing left a depleted seed bank. So that makes a difference too. And there is grazing in most of southeastern Oregon now too. And if they're overgrazing, that's going to impact forbs too. There are probably low levels of grazing that are compatible with having decent forbs.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the mowing having almost a positive effect on the forb compared to, grazing seeming pretty detrimental.
Yeah, mowing, I think it's not as good as fire, but it's much more controllable. And we're really trying to start some studies to look at that closely and see if mowing is a realistic response here in Central Oregon. You have to be careful about that because sagebrush is really important too. So if you're going to mow, you need to be sure you have a lot of sagebrush around.
Right. Assuming favorable habitat, how far does a sage-grouse typically range from its birth site?
Fun question. Early on, maybe 1 to 3 miles, but once grouse can fly and the mother hen knows where there's other resources, in one of the studies was done here in Central Oregon, we had some grouse flying 25 miles for different resources. So they would go all the way from the Milliken Valley out towards Hampton, practically all that way. So grouse habitat, for their range is incredible. I mean, it's tens of thousands of acres. You need big spaces for good grouse habitat.
What is the quality of habitat in Heart Mountain?
Heart Mountain has really excellent habitat. That's one area in the state where the grouse numbers have remained fairly stable. They have good sagebrush there. They have good understory, and that's a bright spot. And actually, that's where the background photo that you're looking at right now was taken. I took that, or Dennis Hansen took that a couple of springs ago when we were out there.
So this other question, you may have already kind of touched on this, but do the sage-grouse migrate on a level that we would recognize?
Not as far as other birds do. We have these birds that go up to Alaska and birds that go down to South America. The grouse don't do that. So the grouse here probably wouldn't go farther than 20 miles. That would be a long way to go. 5 or 10 miles is much more typical during their seasonal forays.
And we have several questions about the fires and, good and bad. Are good ones low intensity ones? Or do we have programs to manage good ones?
Yeah, well, we've suppressed fires for so long. When we get fires now, particularly with thick sagebrush, they're huge and they're hard to stop. So from that standpoint, fire is problematic. People have talked about trying to do prescribed fires in small areas, but they're very worried about those fires escaping. So, it's a problem. And, it's a problem afterwards because we've got, most of these fires occur in BLM land, and most of that is grazing allotments. And so if you're a rancher and you get a fire, you want to get your cows back out there as soon as possible. And if you put them out within a year or two, damage can be done to that area. So they're between a rock and a hard place. So fire is problematic, and we don't have a very good solution to that yet.
Right. The food chart with the weeks of growth, someone's asking which one was week 1.
Week 1 was right at the beginning. It started with the juveniles. 0 was when they hatch.
Okay. And are there introduced species that are increasing predation on grouse?
Oh, you mean like animal species?
Yeah, I think they mean.
Good question. I can't think of any. The predators for grouse are mainly coyotes, ravens, badgers can do it. Um, the cats can do it. Um, but I don't know of any exotic introductions
Okay.
that are predators.
I have a couple questions about what we can do to encourage restoration of habitat or restoring forbs.
Join the Audubon Society. Um, you know, stay in touch with your congressman. We've had some challenges during the last administration trying to do protection for sage grouse. That is likely to change. So there's a political aspect. The Audubon Society, we do field trips where we mark fences, cut junipers. We're going to do some planting and other things. So if you want to join the Audubon Society, we'd be glad to have you work with us. And, the BLM does projects. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a good contact. So, and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Okay. And I did, for those of you in the audience in the chat, I entered the East Cascades Audubon Society website as well as SageCon, which both have good information about sage grouse. All right, and we have a couple more. Well, we have quite a few more questions. They keep coming in. Thank you, everyone. Is there any potential for improving sage grouse habitat right in Bend, Redmond, Sisters area on our BLM lands?
Well, in between Bend and Redmond, the grouse are gone, and I don't. The juniper is thick enough there, and there's enough civilization there that I don't think we're going to get that back. I think the good options are out east of town, down in southeastern Oregon, where we have the wide open spaces. There's not a lot of traffic. There's not a lot of recreation. The OHV systems here are problematic for the birds. The paragliding is problematic for the birds. So they just don't like having a lot of disturbance. I think we do have chances. Heart Mountain is an area where it's a almost 300,000 acre refuge, and so that is a good spot for grouse. And I think if we can maintain that, maybe expand that, there's some opportunities there. Other states have set up sage grouse conservation areas. Oregon has not done that yet, but that might be an option too.
Did we once have sage grouse closer to Bend, like near Rickard Road or the Badland at one point?
Oh yeah. I think a long time ago, 100 years ago or more, before the juniper trees invaded those areas, that probably was considered habitat. And in northern Oregon, up where all the wheat fields are now, all those places probably had tons of sage grouse. So yeah, they were much more widespread before we Euro-Americans came on board.
Right. Let's see here. Is there a location to observe the lek without disturbing the grouse in any way?
I'm very nervous about that. I just anymore I don't even go to leks. There's so few. When I first came to Bend 40 years ago, we could go to Milliken and see 20 to 30 birds out there, but those are all extinct now. Wow. So there's really not any specific place I could refer you to. We do have a woman in the Audubon Society that occasionally will take groups out under strict conditions in the spring. And there is a gentleman out at the Roaring Springs Ranch in southeastern Oregon who is starting a lek viewing business. So on private property there, they have an opportunity to take people out and actually show them grouse doing their dancing. And if people if people are interested in that, contact me and I can hook you up with Andrew Olson.
And I will say, going on the East Cascades Audubon website, you wrote an article about precautions, an abundance of precautions of safely viewing leks. So I will say that could be a resource, even though you are discouraging that. Let's see.
One other thing. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Nature Conservancy have been putting up a Sage-grouse Lekking webcam. They didn't do it last year, but I think they're going to try and do it this coming season. And so that will be up on the Audubon website, and that's really fun. When that was going for 2 or 3 years, I get up every morning. They had a game camera out at a lek, and you could just watch what was going on. It was really fun and fascinating. So
that is way warmer and more comfortable to get out of bed at 5 a.m. and look at that than going out in the field.
Exactly.
Let's see here. Let's do one more question. Is the BLM monitoring to prevent overgrazing?
The short answer is yes. But, they've got one range conservationist for, 1 million acres. So it's really hard for them to keep close watch on things. And the ranchers are trying to do the best they can too. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's most of the questions. I appreciate everyone asking questions and taking time out of your night to join us. Thank you so much, Stu, for sharing your wealth of knowledge on this. We've had quite a few people in the chats. Very happy and glad that you took the time to meet with us. For you in the audience, thank you. And for you in the audience, the Deschutes Public Library has many wonderful programs. This month, No Place has been really fun. So I encourage you to go to our calendar, deschuteslibrary.org/calendar. Or you can go to our YouTube page. This program has been recorded. We have many programs that have been recorded and are still available on YouTube. And I encourage you to check that out. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, Stu.
Thank you, Laurel. This has been great.
Yeah, and check out those links I put in for the East Cascades Audubon Society to find out how you can get involved in helping these sage grouse get more forbs and insects in their diet.